Time is just gone 9:29 a.m. as we continue with the broadcast this morning, and we are now going to be focusing on Kashmir. And we know every now and then there are events that take place that need to be commemorated. And one of them has been Martyrs Day in Kashmir. Now, for the last 3 years, there has been no Martyrs Day, so no commemoration, and also Kashmir Martyrs Week. We joined on the line this morning by co-founder of Let Kashmir Decide, Claire Bidwell. Claire, good morning to you. Welcome to the show.
Good morning. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, Claire, as I mentioned, every now and then there are events that define the course of history. And when these events take place, people go back down memory lane and also commemorate this day. And Martyrs Day is extremely important. It is relevant in a place like Kashmir, but for 3 years in a row now, we've noticed this day hasn't been observed. There has been no function. And just to understand the commemoration of Martyrs Day in Kashmir, what it actually means, and perhaps even some background as to why this day is commemorated.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a key time, obviously, in history and the history of Kashmir. One of the reasons it stays commemorated is the fact that it was kind of the uprising of the first independent movement for Jammu Kashmir. So it was on a particular day, there'd been for about a year, there'd been these groups, and it was under the rule of the Maharaja. And at the time, it was really oppressive. The people of Kashmir were given, the actual people of Kashmir were under a very strict and brutal rule. Everything within their lifestyle was taken away from them. It was used by a very strict sort of monarchical role. And so on these uprisings had been happening for about a year, lots of meetings, particularly by the youths, gathering together. I'm struggling to remember the name. They called themselves something like the Library Group. That got together, and then around this time there was a big gathering outside the Maharaja's palace, and it was actually a kind of a worker of a British armyman that had stood outside and had made this impromptu speech about, it was better, they weren't going to get through words and peace, and it was better to come with sticks and stones. So he was actually arrested and then kept inside the jail. And it was actually on the day of he was under sedition. So it was actually on the day of his trial that everybody, they'd heard, and they all gathered round. There was huge masses of them. And so on the day of the trial, people attempted to get into the jail. And then with that, around the call to prayer arose, and one of them stood up to begin the prayer, that was shot in cold blood. And then one after another came and were just shot in cruel, brutal blood. And 22 of them were martyred on that particular day. And it so kicked off the stand up for their own rights and for the independent movement in Kashmir. And I think that's why it stays, obviously, a tragic story. And then that began a series of events that continued on that and began the struggle.
Yes, and reports have it that this took place on July the 13th, and it was declared a public holiday. And this was a function that was held every year, and also where you would have people like the chief minister or the governor who were the guests. But now we've seen this administration dropping this day from a list of gazetted holidays. So this was an official holiday, Claire.
Yeah, I mean, it was an official holiday, and I think it's all part, since the revocation of 370, it's a part to have, change the narratives and have their stay over the state. They don't particularly want this story of the uprising and fight for independence coming out. There's also possibly the religious connotation under it that this was a Hindu ruler at the time. So by burying this story and keeping the gates locked, it's their attempt to do away with that, to do with the fight, the humanitarian crisis, and raising issue to the fact of that, at least that's how it feels. We do know that the Kashmiris themselves mark it as a lockdown. They shut down the buildings for today, and they're quite strongly in saying, you know, they might stop or try and stop that Martyrs' Day, but they're not going to take away their resolve and their courage to stand up for their rights.
Yes. Now, you know, at that point in time, you know, we're talking about the Maharaja, we're talking about the British Army. And now we are looking at Indian-controlled, occupied Kashmir. And this is now the Indian government that has basically stopped this holiday. Now, which, you know, obviously doesn't make sense, because at the end of the day, the Indian government was not in charge of Kashmir at that point in time. And just trying to understand what is the thinking, what is the agenda behind the Indian government abolishing this holiday, and the fact that this day was not commemorated or observed.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, going back to the time of the 13th of July, 1931, you know, offset these political, peaceful regimes, whereas 10 years later, you know, they were looking at forming a government and taking this forward. And then it was the British that came in and partitioned the land in 1947 and divided it between India and Pakistan, that then stopped this kind of process through the governing for Kashmiri people. So again, one can only assume that it's their brutal clampdown in terms of erasing. For me, it's about erasing these stories of people's uprising. It's about erasing the stories of Kashmiris coming forward and standing up for themselves. It's possibly also about the stories of, you know, making this religious by this extreme Hindutva government, and any stories that talks about, you know, the involvement of Muslims coming forward because they were the dominant religious, you know, the dominant religious following at the time. So it's also perhaps tied in to the two of those, that they're making it, you know, the religious issue, and they're making it, you know, you are part of India, you belong to India. Therefore, to them, that they don't see it in such the way as Martyrs' Day, because that would pay attention to well, why were there these martyrs here? And bringing forward that story about Kashmiri's desire to have their own right in their own future. And obviously we're seeing now such a clampdown, you know, on Kashmiris and Indian occupied Kashmir, to the point that we don't even hear their voices anymore. You know, their leaders locked up, we've got human rights activists locked up, even reporters. There's hardly any voice come out of Indian occupied Kashmir. So it's part of their brutal regime and part, you know, control to change that narrative and pull it away from uprisings, etc.
Exactly. And also in terms of silencing their voices and silencing what they should be observing and what they shouldn't be observing. At the end of the day, I think the name of your organizations just says so much. Let Kashmir Decide. And at this point in time, they have absolutely no say whatsoever, and they cannot make any decision in any way whatsoever as well, Claire.
Absolutely. It's totally taken away from them, removed from them. And, you know, Kashmir belongs to Kashmiris, not to anybody else. And their voices should be listened to, taken forward. I mean, we saw there recently at Eid, they weren't even allowed to celebrate, you know, within their religious building in the mosques. They were all closed. They were all locked. And yeah, so we're seeing just this clampdown of freedom, and Kashmiris have the right to decide as a sovereign state, and also as enshrined in the UN resolutions. Human rights abuses need to be looked at wherever they are, and we're not even allowed into Indian occupied Kashmir to see what's going on or what's happening. So it's very sad circumstances for them right now.
Well, Claire, as always, we appreciate you taking time out, talking to us. We wish you well. And once again, we thank you for your time. Please be well and take care.
I will do. Thank you very much.
Claire Bidwell, co-founder of Let Kashmir Decide, with us this morning. And with that, the time is just gone 9:39. We're going to go for a break. We come back. We'll be joined by Minara Chamber of Commerce's Ibrahim Patel.